Good morning. A few weeks ago, I thought that I might discuss misused verses in the Bible. And while that wasn't well received, there were several people who have expressed an interest in one particular verse. And so, even though I don't plan to continue that series, I think probably I will discuss a few of them maybe as time goes by, but not as a series. But I want to talk about that one this morning that quite a number of people wanted to hear. And before I begin that, I want to say that and this is in regard to all of those verses that I had intended to discuss. In most instances, when I personally heard those passages misapplied or misused, the ones who misapplied them actually thought they were using them correctly. Uh, and certainly that applies to the one that we're going to talk about this morning. But before I get into that, I want to say that uh, very few of us have total recall. Uh, I certainly don't. And there probably isn't that many people who have completely memorized the Bible. Uh, I haven't. But most of us have a few verses tucked away in our minds, maybe in the far reaches of our minds or the back recesses of them. Uh, Tony Ripley used to preach for us here quite a few years ago, and he compared the human mind one time to a bunch of filing cabinets that are stored with drawers in them. And as life goes on, a person uh, sees things and sticks them in those drawers. And the older we get, the more drawers, the more filing cabinets that we have, and they're getting more full all the time. And so, uh, oftentimes we don't open those drawers enough to keep our minds fresh on everything that is there. And so it's hard for us to recall information quickly. If it's something that has happened just in the recent past, yes, we can recall it pretty quickly. Uh, and some of us can remember things that were long ago much better than they can remember things that are happening now. Uh, but on the average, the person is a person is able to recall information rather quickly if it's just recently happened, and so uh, it's not unlikely that you would recognize a passage if someone began to quote that passage for us. And as a matter of fact, I think probably most of us have been sitting in an audience when a speaker began to quote a verse, and our minds just automatically finished that verse for them. So they're there. Uh, the problem is in recalling them fully, getting all of it out. Uh, if you were to ask me to quote uh, a passage from Jeremiah chapter 28, verse 10, and I just picked that out of the air, I have no idea what is contained in that verse, and I would not be able to quote that for you. And that's probably true with a lot of us. we know where it is. We can find them quickly with if we've got our Bible with us, but they're not stuck away in our minds. Maybe they should be, but we just don't go to that effort. But anyway, get back on track. Like I said, this shouldn't take but 10 minutes if I don't get too windy. So the verses that are stored in our minds, I think we probably all have quite a few of them. And we just don't realize it. And under the right circumstances or the right conditions, we can recall them. And when we bring them to the surface, we may not remember the context in which they were used. We may not remember the conditions that existed at the time that was being spoken of in that passage. But we remember the passage, and so we may use it to address a certain situation. And that's kind of what I meant when I said that we all have a few verses tucked away there, and under the right circumstances, we remember them. My purpose when I originally thought about addressing these 13 or 14 that I had in mind, it wasn't to shame anyone. I don't intend to do that. There's not a doubt in my mind that most of the wrongly applied scriptures were done honestly. The person thought they were using them correctly. But as I said, we don't always remember the circumstances or the context in which the verses were used, and so sometimes it's rather easy to misapply a verse. And that's what I want to talk about today, because that is especially true in the one that I intend to talk about. Matthew chapter 18, verse 20. Jesus is the one that is speaking in that passage, and I'll read it to you. It says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them." We all know that Jesus is the Son of God, and we also know that his purpose in coming to this earth was to provide a way for people to be reconciled to God and live with him eternally in heaven. And so the words that he spoke, they were not spoken vaguely. There were never any of those words that were indistinct. He always was very direct, precise when he spoke. And so when he spoke these words, he was being that direct and that precise. Knowing that, then, why did Jesus use the phrase 2 or 3? He said, when 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name. Why did he say 2 or 3? If his purpose was, as some believe it to be, to express the least number of people that could be gathered together for worship, he would not have said 2 or 3. He would have used the expression 2 or more, or some other expression that would express that. But he would not have used 2 and 3, because remember, he speaks precisely. And so 2 or 3 is distinct. It meant literally 2 or 3. I'll ask the question, what about 4? Can 4 do it? Well, of course they can. When we as a congregation come together as a group and worship on Sunday mornings or other times, is he with us? Well, of course he is. He's also with single individuals, people who are alone, maybe practicing as he instructed us to, praying where no one else can hear us. Is he with us when we do that? Well, of course he is. And I think everybody understands that. So, therefore, I think it's only correct to say that when he uses this passage and makes this two or three distinct people, he's not talking about a specific number of people that have to be gathered together, a specific number of people that are required to be together in order for him to be with us. That isn't what he's doing. If not, then he must be talking about something else. What would that be? Well, that's where the term context comes into the picture. Context means background, circumstances, situations. So, what were the circumstances, the background, or the situation that caused Jesus to say what he said? One of the best ways to understand the context is to read all of the surrounding passages. What was said before he said what we're discussing, or what comes after he said what we were discussing. What was the general topic that was being discussed when he said what he said? To understand exactly what Jesus meant in Matthew 18:20, we have to look at the context. Verse 20 is the last verse of a paragraph. So it's part of the conclusion of the paragraph. Paragraph begins back up in verse 15. And right away, when you read verse 15, we see that Jesus is addressing a particular situation. He's talking about what should be done if a brother trespasses, specifically trespasses against you. How do we do that? How do we reconcile that? Well, notice that the very first thing that he says is that the two of you need to get together and work out your differences privately. When an incident occurs where only two people are involved in it, there is no need for anyone else to even be aware of it. The two of you get together and work it out. Sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes there's more people involved in it than that. Or sometimes someone else might witness that situation, and it's more difficult. So if those two people cannot work it out, and it needs to go further than that, then verse 16 continues the thought. If the two of you cannot work out the difference, then take with thee one or two more, he says. And this is the phrase where two or three comes into play, because it's first used there in verse 16. And when it's used there, it's used because as Jesus continues, he says, at the mouth of two or three witnesses, every word may be established. What Jesus is doing is he is causing the Jewish mind to focus on what was recorded for them in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, and even again, I think, in chapter 19. That expression, two or three witnesses are required to testify to the truth. So when Jesus continues his discourse there in Matthew 18, the further action that is needed is so that we learn that 2 or 3 witnesses establish the truth. Now that's the summary that he gives in verse 20, where he says, "For where 2 or 3 witnesses are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." Several commentators, when they discuss this passage, say that Jesus is instructing the disciples on how they, and by inference those that come after them, should handle situations dealing with sin and with conflict. And I believe they're correct. It appears to me that whenever the church is attempting to reconcile a sinner back into the fold, and not always, but much of the time, the elders are the ones who are involved in doing that. They need to pursue that endeavor very carefully. They need to get to the truth. Sometimes that truth comes from gathering all the facts from all of those who have firsthand knowledge of the things that happened, not just from one. Even if they trust that one individual completely, they cannot come to a decision, a correct decision, with just one witness. It takes 2 or more. There must be a plurality of them. Since this verse is talking about Christians, the ones who are gathered in his name are Christians, then the truth will be revealed from 2 witnesses or more. The issue can be resolved. It can be handled. And so all can be comforted by knowing that the right thing was done. If everything is done as if Jesus is right there among them, which he is, if everything is done properly, then the truth of the Scripture is verified. The purpose for church discipline, the end result that is achieved when everything is done properly, is the restoration of the one who is lost. There are several parables that Jesus spoke that expresses the joy in heaven over the restoration of one lost soul. This verse, Matthew 18 and verse 20, deals with that bringing back, that restoration of a sinner. And he's telling his disciples, and through his word, us today, that we have to be careful how we handle that, because a person's soul is at stake. I hope you have a good day. Good evening.